Bedford Hills Correctional Facility does not erupt into violence without warning. What it offers instead is something quieter and far more dangerous: pressure that accumulates slowly, invisibly, day after day, until a single order is enough to fracture control. The housing unit at the center of this story sat deep inside New York's only maximum security prison for women. It was not isolation. It was not disciplinary segregation. It was a functioning living unit, cells stacked along a concrete corridor, steel doors scarred by decades of use, narrow windows reinforced with mesh that filtered daylight into a dull gray haze. The air inside the unit was always stale. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bleaching color from faces and flattening time itself. There was no true night here, only dimmer light and quieter movement. For the women housed inside, days blurred together into a routine defined by counts, controlled movement, and constant surveillance. Most of the women in this unit were not short-term inmates. They were serving long sentences, years, decades, in some cases life. Many had arrived young and aged inside these walls. Wrinkles formed under institutional lighting. Hair grayed without privacy or dignity. Bodies carried scars not just from the outside world, but from prison itself. They woke early. Doors opened in sequence with the metallic rhythm that every inmate learned to recognize. Boots struck concrete. Officers moved down the tier, keys jangling, voices clipped and procedural. Breakfast trays slid through slots. Medications were dispensed. Count was taken, then taken again. On the surface, it looked controlled. Underneath, resentment simmered. Strip searches had become a recurring presence in life at Bedford Hills. Officially, they were framed as security measures, responses to contraband, disturbances, or alleged threats. But for the women subjected to them, they represented something else entirely: the ultimate assertion of power over the body. Many of the women housed here were survivors of abuse long before they entered prison. Sexual violence, domestic violence, exploitation, these were not exceptions but patterns. A forced strip search did not exist in a vacuum. It activated memory, trauma, panic, and rage. And this was not the first time Bedford Hills had faced allegations over its use of strip searches. Over the years, civil rights lawsuits, advocacy reports, and investigative journalism had documented claims that women were subjected to mass strip searches without individualized suspicion. That searches were used as punishment rather than necessity. That officers sometimes escalated encounters rather than de-escalating them. Policies had been rewritten. Language softened. Training mandates issued. But inside this unit, the women knew that policy often stopped at the edge of paper. The morning of the incident began without violence. No alarms. No emergency response. No weapons discovered. There had been a minor disturbance earlier in the day, raised voices, conflicting accounts, a brief disruption that did not result in injury. But in prison, minor incidents have a way of growing. By late morning, officers' behavior shifted. The women noticed immediately. Incarceration sharpens perception. When you have little control, you learn to read everything. Officers lingered longer in the corridor. Radios crackled more often. A supervisor appeared where one normally did not. Conversations between officers lowered in volume but increased in intensity. The women watched from their cells. Word began to spread quietly, passed through glances and whispers. They're talking about searches. Not cells. Us. That distinction mattered. Cell searches were invasive but familiar. Strip searches were different. They were personal. They were humiliating. They required complete submission, often without explanation beyond an alleged threat that could never be verified. As the afternoon progressed, tension thickened. The unit felt smaller, narrower. Conversations between inmates stopped abruptly when officers passed. Some women sat on their bunks, staring at the floor. Others stood at their doors, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the corridor. Fear expressed itself differently from cell to cell. Some women attempted to prepare psychologically, folding clothes neatly, rehearsing compliance, telling themselves to endure it and survive. Others showed visible agitation, pacing, clenched fists, shallow breathing, muttered curses. A few women refused to prepare at all. They had been here before. They remembered previous searches. They remembered promises that were never kept. They remembered filing grievances that disappeared into bureaucratic silence. One woman reportedly said, "They can't keep doing this." Another responded quietly, "They do because no one stops them." That exchange captured the divide forming inside the unit. For years, this housing block had absorbed pressure without release. Complaints were normalized. Anger was internalized. Resistance was postponed in the hope that compliance might bring relief. But compliance had not brought relief. By mid-afternoon, officers began gathering at one end of the corridor. Their posture was formal, rigid. Hands rested near belts. Batons and restraints were visible, though not yet deployed. A line began to form, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate. The women understood what that formation meant. Instructions were issued. Remain in your cells. Prepare for searches. There was no individualized accusation. No explanation of what had allegedly been found. No attempt to address the growing fear inside the unit. The order was procedural, stripped of context. What officers viewed as routine, the women experienced as collective punishment. What administrators would later describe as a measured response, the inmates felt as a warning: resistance would not be tolerated. The corridor fell silent in a way that felt unnatural. Even the constant background noise of prison life, radios, distant doors, echoing footsteps, seemed to recede. Time stretched. Every woman understood that the next minutes would matter. This was the point where control could still be maintained. Or lost. Strip searches do not just remove clothing. They remove agency. They remind the subject that their body is not their own. Repeated often enough, they transform fear into something harder, sharper. Inside that housing unit at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, dignity had been eroded for years. On this day, it was about to be tested again. The women stood at the threshold between submission and refusal. The officers stood at the threshold between enforcement and escalation. No one shouted. No one moved yet. This was the moment before the order became force. The moment when the prison still believed it was in control. And the moment when that belief was about to be challenged. By the time officers gathered at the end of the corridor, the women inside the housing unit already understood something critical: this was no longer about contraband. It was about control. The women housed in this unit at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility were not a single, unified group. They came from different backgrounds, different charges, different generations. Some were serving life sentences. Others were nearing parole. Some had been incarcerated for decades, others were still learning the unspoken rules of survival inside a maximum security women's prison. What bound them together was exposure. Every woman in this unit lived under the same fluorescent lights, the same rigid schedules, the same threat of collective punishment. And when the order for strip searches loomed, it did not discriminate by sentence length, disciplinary history, or mental health status. Inside the unit were mothers who had given birth in shackles years earlier and never forgotten it. Women whose children had grown up without them. Women who still carried folded photographs inside legal folders, creased from being handled too often. There were women with diagnosed mental illnesses, PTSD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, conditions that prison rarely stabilized and often aggravated. Strip searches were especially destabilizing for them. The sudden loss of bodily autonomy, the forced exposure, the commands shouted by authority figures, it could fracture fragile emotional control in seconds. There were also women who had learned how to endure by becoming hard. These were the long-term inmates. The institutionalized. Women who knew how to stand still during count, how to keep their faces neutral, how to comply just enough to avoid punishment while remembering every slight. Their bodies bore prison tattoos, names, dates, symbols of loyalty and loss. Their eyes were alert, calculating, rarely surprised. They had seen this before. They remembered earlier mass searches. They remembered women crying in cells afterward, shaking uncontrollably. They remembered officers who rotated out, promoted, or retired while inmates remained. They remembered filing grievances that went nowhere. And they remembered something else: every time the prison crossed a line and nothing happened afterward, that line moved closer. Power inside a women's prison does not operate the same way it does in men's facilities. There were no large gangs controlling the tier. No overt displays of dominance through violence. Instead, power moved through quieter channels, social bonds, emotional alliances, shared trauma. Certain women held influence not because they were feared, but because they were trusted. Women who had helped others through panic attacks. Women who shared commissary with those who had nothing. Women who spoke calmly when others spiraled. When those women reacted strongly, others paid attention. As news of the impending searches spread, eyes began drifting toward those figures. Some of them stayed silent, watching officers assemble. Others shook their heads. One reportedly said quietly, "They're pushing again." Another responded, "They always do." This was not incitement. It was recognition. Correctional officers in the unit represented the other side of the power equation. They were bound by hierarchy, protocol, and command structure. Orders came from supervisors. Supervisors answered to administrators. Individual officers had limited discretion once an order was given. But discretion did not disappear entirely. Some officers in the unit had reputations among inmates, known to escalate encounters quickly, known to interpret hesitation as defiance. Others were viewed as more predictable, more procedural. The women could often tell, by posture and tone, which type of officer they were dealing with. On this day, the line forming at the end of the corridor included both. That mattered. Because strip searches require compliance to proceed smoothly. Any hesitation can become confrontation. Any confrontation can become force. As the officers prepared, the women inside the unit experienced a psychological narrowing. Attention focused inward, on their own bodies, their own memories. For some, the anticipation was worse than the act itself. A strip search is not just an order to remove clothing. It is a command to surrender dignity in front of authority figures who may or may not treat that vulnerability with care. At Bedford Hills, many women believed that care was no longer guaranteed. The sense of collective exposure changed the dynamic inside the unit. Conversations that would normally stay private became shared. Anxiety became contagious. Anger fed on fear. Some women whispered strategies: how to comply without breaking down, how to keep eyes fixed on the wall, how to breathe slowly. Others whispered refusals. "I'm not doing it. They can't make all of us." Those statements did not come from impulsive inmates. They came from women who had weighed the consequences. Women who understood that resistance could mean solitary confinement, loss of privileges, disciplinary tickets that could delay parole. But they also understood something else: compliance had not protected them either. The officers, for their part, saw a unit that was not behaving the way it should. Silence replaced chatter. Stillness replaced routine movement. Too many eyes watched too closely. From an enforcement perspective, this signaled risk. From the inmate's perspective, it signaled inevitability. The imbalance of power was absolute on paper. Officers carried authority, keys, radios, restraints. Inmates carried none of those things. But power inside prisons is not only physical. It is psychological. And psychology can shift suddenly. As the order approached, the women began to mirror each other unconsciously. Arms crossed. Feet planted. Chins lifted slightly. Not aggressive. Not submissive. Defensive. The shared understanding was unspoken but widespread: if this search happened the way previous ones had, something would break. The women were not planning violence. There was no organized uprising at this stage. There were no weapons prepared, no coded signals exchanged. What existed instead was alignment. Alignment born from shared history, shared humiliation, and shared exhaustion. When officers stepped closer to the cells, that alignment tightened. Every woman in that unit knew she would be seen as an individual during the search, but punished as part of a group. Every officer knew that one refusal could cascade into many. This was the unstable equilibrium that prisons fear most, a unit full of people who feel they have nothing left to lose in that moment. The power dynamic inside the housing unit was no longer vertical. It was compressing inward, pushing toward a single point of decision. The officers prepared to issue the next command. The women prepared to decide whether to obey it. And in that narrowing space between authority and dignity, the conditions for violence were already in place. The order did not come with raised voices. That was the first thing many of the women noticed. It came calmly, delivered in a flat, procedural tone that prisons use when they want obedience without discussion. A supervisor stepped forward. Officers positioned themselves along the corridor. Radios were checked. Keys stopped jangling. Then the instruction was issued. The housing unit was to submit to strip searches. Not selectively. Not based on individual suspicion. Entirely. The women heard it from inside their cells, standing at the bars, sitting on bunks, gripping metal frames. For a moment, nothing happened. No immediate refusals. No shouting. Just a pause, long enough for the meaning of the order to settle. In that pause, years of experience collided with the present moment. Some women began to comply instinctively. They stepped back from cell doors, gathering clothing, preparing themselves mentally. Compliance had kept them safe before. Or at least, less punished. Others did not move. Officers began approaching the first cells. Instructions were repeated. Firm but still controlled. The procedure was unfolding the way it always did, until it wasn't. The first refusal was quiet. A woman near the middle of the unit shook her head. She did not yell. She did not threaten. She simply said no. Officers paused. That mattered. In prison, momentum is everything. Once procedures begin, they rely on repetition and predictability. A refusal interrupts that rhythm. It forces choice. The officer nearest her repeated the instruction. She did not comply. Another woman nearby spoke up, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard. "I'm not doing that." Within seconds, the emotional temperature of the unit changed. Officers adjusted their stance. Radios crackled. A supervisor stepped closer. The refusal was no longer isolated. From cell to cell, hesitation spread. Some women who had been preparing stopped. Others stepped forward to the bars. This was not coordinated rebellion. It was something more volatile, collective hesitation. The supervisor addressed the unit again, emphasizing policy, consequences, discipline. The words were familiar. The women had heard them before. They had also seen how those consequences were applied unevenly. Still, the order stood. Officers began attempting to remove women from cells to initiate the searches. That was the moment the situation escalated. Physical contact in prison is never neutral. Even a guiding hand on an arm can be interpreted as force when tension is already high. When the first officer reached toward an inmate who had refused, voices rose. Another woman shouted from her cell. Then another. Not slogans. Not chants. Protests, raw, emotional, overlapping. Officers moved in closer formation. The corridor narrowed with bodies. Commands became sharper. Compliance was demanded. A woman pulled her arm away. That single movement, small, instinctive, triggered the response the prison had been preparing for. Officers moved decisively. Training took over. Control holds were applied. Radios erupted with coded calls. The sound of boots multiplied. From the inmate's perspective, the situation flipped instantly. What had been an order became an assault. What had been resistance became survival. Women shouted warnings to each other. Some backed away deeper into cells. Others pressed forward, unable or unwilling to retreat. The confined space amplified everything. Concrete walls reflected sound. Steel doors rattled. Bodies collided. Orders were shouted over one another. The air filled with panic and anger. Officers attempted to regain control by isolating perceived leaders. That tactic backfired. When women saw others being restrained, fear tipped into fury. A woman screamed when an officer forced her back against the bars. Another tried to intervene verbally. A third reached out instinctively, and was pushed back. Within minutes, the unit was no longer compliant. It was volatile. Officers called for additional staff. The corridor filled further. The visual imbalance of power grew more pronounced: uniforms, equipment, coordinated movement against women in thin state-issued clothing in confined cells. But numbers alone did not restore control. The women were not armed. There were no improvised weapons. The violence that erupted was chaotic and close-range, pushing, grappling, bodies struggling for balance in a space never designed for confrontation. Several women fell. One struck the concrete hard enough to leave her stunned. Another cried out in pain when her arm was twisted behind her back. Officers shouted for compliance as restraints were deployed. From the officer's perspective, the situation had crossed into a use of force scenario. Protocol demanded containment. From the women's perspective, the prison had confirmed their worst fear: dignity was irrelevant, and force was always an option. The strip searches themselves were effectively halted by the chaos. The goal shifted from searching to suppressing. Cells slammed shut. Doors locked. Officers pushed women back inside wherever possible. The corridor became a line of containment rather than inspection. The shouting continued, echoing down the tier. Some women sobbed. Others screamed in anger. A few went silent, shock settling in. Officers continued issuing commands, attempting to restore order through volume and repetition. The unit did not immediately respond. Minutes stretched. Time distorted. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. The presence of additional officers, helmets visible, posture rigid, shifted the balance again. The message was clear: resistance would not continue unchecked. Gradually, the unit stabilized, not because tensions resolved, but because exhaustion set in. Women retreated into cells, some assisted, some forced. Restraints were removed or adjusted. Officers began checking for injuries, both inmate and staff. The corridor looked different now. Clothing lay scattered where the struggle had happened. The air smelled sharp and metallic. Breathing was heavy. Faces were flushed. Eyes wide. The strip search order had triggered something far larger than anticipated. What began as a procedural response to alleged contraband had become a violent confrontation that neither side had fully intended, but both had enabled. The prison had regained control. But it had lost something else. Because once force replaces compliance, every future order carries the memory of what happens when resistance is met with hands instead of words. And inside that housing unit at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, the women understood that nothing would be the same after this moment. The violence ended the way most prison incidents do. Not with resolution, but with silence imposed by force. Once the corridor was secured, the housing unit was placed on immediate lockdown. Cell doors were sealed. Movement ceased. The women were ordered to sit or stand where they were, some still shaking, others staring blankly at concrete walls that had just absorbed the sound of chaos. Officers conducted injury checks quickly and methodically. Some women had visible bruising forming along arms and shoulders. One complained of wrist pain where restraints had been applied too tightly. Another sat on the floor, breathing unevenly, unable to stop shaking. Medical staff were summoned, but access was controlled. Treatment was brief. Documentation came later. From the administration's perspective, the priority was containment. The unit remained locked down for hours. No phone calls. No recreation. No showers. Meals were delayed or delivered cold. The women were left alone with the aftermath, adrenaline draining, fear settling in, anger turning inward. Inside the cells, reactions diverged. Some women cried quietly, replaying the moment when hands reached for them. Others sat rigidly still, dissociated, staring at walls as if nothing had happened. A few paced their cells, furious and restless, knowing exactly how the official narrative would be written. Because they had seen it before. Incident reports would emphasize non-compliance. Use of force justifications would cite officer safety. The strip search order itself would be framed as a necessary response to alleged contraband. What would not fully appear on paper was the fear that preceded the violence, or the history that made it inevitable. In the days that followed, disciplinary consequences were issued selectively. Some women received tickets for refusing orders. Others were moved to segregation. Privileges were suspended. Parole considerations quietly pushed further into the future. For the officers involved, the outcome was different. Internal reviews were initiated, as required. Statements were collected. Body-worn footage, if available, was examined within institutional channels. The incident was classified, contained, and filed. But the effects inside the housing unit did not disappear. Trust, already thin, collapsed further. Routine interactions became brittle. Women flinched more easily during counts. Silence replaced even the smallest gestures of cooperation. The memory of that day lingered in posture, in tone, in the way eyes tracked officers moving down the tier. Beyond the prison walls, the incident joined a growing body of complaints and legal challenges tied to strip searches in women's prisons. Advocacy groups cited it as another example of how policy and practice diverge. Attorneys gathered testimony. Investigations moved slowly. Change, if it came at all, would take years. For the women who lived through it, time moved differently. Some carried physical pain that faded. Others carried psychological damage that did not. The sense that their bodies could be taken without warning. That compliance was never protection. That resistance came at a cost, but silence did too. The prison returned to routine. Counts resumed. Doors opened and closed. Orders were issued and followed. But something had shifted permanently inside that housing unit at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. Because once control is enforced through humiliation and force, it leaves behind a residue that cannot be searched away. And every woman who stood in that corridor understood a hard truth that day. The most dangerous thing in prison is not violence itself. It is what happens when dignity is treated as contraband. Studio microphone OUTRO, cinematic, 100 to 200 words. Prisons are built to contain bodies. But what they often erode, quietly, systematically, is the boundary between safety and domination. At Bedford Hills, the order to strip an entire housing unit was justified as procedure. The violence that followed was classified as disruption. The aftermath was buried in paperwork. But inside those cells, the memory remains alive. Because control enforced through humiliation does not restore order, it fractures it. It teaches compliance through fear, and fear has a way of resurfacing when pressure builds again. This story is not about chaos. It is about warning signs ignored. About power exercised without restraint. About a system that mistook silence for stability, until it broke. If stories like this matter, make sure they are seen. Like the video. Share it. Subscribe. Because prisons do not exist in isolation. And what happens behind locked doors eventually reaches the outside world.